Well, you could immediately tell salespeople were having trouble moving product. So they would say, hey, Vince, listen, land and expand, right? Why don't we just try this? We'll just kind of go ahead and get it started. You'll fall in love with it. A couple months later, you can go ahead and sign up. And of course, those signups weren't occurring. You would never see that. It's not really necessarily going to be in the talk track. You might hear it from a salesperson saying, oh, we're trying land and expand, but you wouldn't associate that with the mechanic of a shorter term, which isn't really in the playbook, and sort of the salesperson going off script because they're just trying to make their numbers, rightfully so.
Welcome to Future Fuzz, the digital marketing podcast.
All right, welcome into Future Fuzz, the digital marketing podcast. I'm Vince Quinn, and today we're talking about creating clarity in the pricing process. And joining us for this conversation is Chris Mele. Chris is the CEO at Software Pricing Partners. Chris, welcome to Future Fuzz.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So first off, just give people a little bit of a background of what you do at Software Pricing Partners.
Well, we build pricing strategies for nothing but software companies. So it started in '82. I was a former customer when I had my software company in the late '90s and into the 2000 timeframe, and then ultimately ended up here because I fell in love with pricing as a discipline and sort of the missing part of the business model that I wish I had known back then, what I know now.
Wow. Okay. So I love that. So what was that? Did you have like a moment where you're like, oh, this is just like, I'm really gripped by this and I need more? What was that like? How did that happen?
Yeah, we closed a deal at probably 1/10 of the value, and I got really frustrated. We thought I left a ton of money on the table, and we were converting from on-prem in '08 during the market crash to the cloud, rebuilding sort of 10 years worth of tech. And a board member recommended that I seek out pricing help. And honestly, I kind of laughed the first time. I was just like, I didn't even know that that was a thing. I didn't even know there were companies that did that. And there weren't that many and still aren't that many that do it. And so in reaching out and learning about that and learning kind of the science behind how to make money, I thought, oh, this is pretty interesting. So we would spend the next probably 4 to 5 years wrapping pricing into more of a process and less of an event. And that's ultimately what made me fall in love with it.
Wow, I love that. And I mean, it makes
it's fun to make money.
Well, yeah, and obviously that
not much fun to lose it.
And that's why it's such a fascinating thing, because it is such a like precious and agonizing decision to figure all of this out, right? Like it's connected because it obviously pricing is on some level the root of everything. It's connected to everything that you're doing, what your margins look like, the kinds of investments you can make, just all of it. So when it comes to pricing, I mean, on the simplest level that I could possibly ask this, why is pricing so hard?
Well, it is really hard in a lot of ways because of what you just said. The decisions that you make. I'll give you an example. Where just a couple of weeks ago, there was a client who, in a meeting, decided that they wanted to change the moment at which they start discounting. So they were just after a higher, larger transaction, and then you would start to earn some structured incentives. And there was a programmatic structure there that we were putting them in place for them. They were surprised. We have our own software platform when we showed them, hey, this is an $8.5 million decision. And everybody was like, holy, like I just was moving from, this number to that. And those are very sobering when you start to realize just these really small, innocuous decisions that you would process in a meeting as if you were just talking and having a beer have real financial implications. And of course, if you don't know that and you make that decision, all of a sudden you do some damage. And those are the stories that get like told and retold. And so there's a bit of a haunting that has followed, I think, people's footsteps here a bit. Like, oh gosh, if you change this and you make a mistake, like you could be doing a career limiting move. And that, of course, is what also makes it not just complicated, but very fearful.
Yeah. So, I mean, for you to get involved in these kinds of things and have these conversations with companies, I mean, typically, what does the situation look like when you tend to get involved?
Shortly after an investment, so at what we would call at the front of the holding period. So typically private equity would hold for 5 years and then sell. It turns out they don't really want to mess with much near the end of the period because it's being prepped for sale and there's just too much downside risk. But in the beginning, that's kind of a natural time. Other natural times are a new executive team, a new product launch, some new competitive threat that is emerging, whether it's from a new AI startup or just some sort of competitive phenomenon that you need to respond to, or really, I think if you want to know what's kind of changed in the last couple of years, is sort of inflection point where it's no longer like growth, it's more around profitability. And so I think since 1982, the firm has largely, Software Pricing Partners as a firm has largely preached, you really should treat pricing as a discipline. And everybody's like, yeah, well, I'm growing. And then really until 2022, when the private equity started to dry up because everybody was doing kind of debt financing, and then that whole sort of twerking of the industry kind of emerged into some layoffs, as well as refocusing on and demanding profitability is really what's kind of encouraging people during this inflection point to refocus on, okay, like I need to show the board, like we're making money, like we're not just losing it.
Yeah. I mean, on some level, like, how does this happen? I mean, it just sounds like such a colossal oversight, just like across the board, that people aren't so invested. Like you said, you're one of the few companies that focuses on this kind of thing. It's just kind of stunning of how little attention is paid to it.
Well, so I've reflected on that a lot, Vince. So I would tell you that when I was onboarded in software, there's no talk of this. I mean, you build a great product, you spend the dollars on the product, and in fact, even in the boardrooms that I sat on, it was all around product expenses and customer acquisition and conversion rates and all that stuff. But I often wonder if a board member was to say, well, hey, Vince, that's a great idea, but like how much money did you spend on the science behind designing how you're going to make money on this thing that you build? You would largely hear crickets. It's just not, it's not in the curriculum. It's not in the onboarding process. It's not in anything that an entrepreneur would learn to treat this as a science and a discipline. And in fact, I think it goes one step further. Many people would underappreciate the science and say, well, that's just like a bunch of black magic. Like there's a black box. These guys charge us a ton of money and they come out with this magic stuff. And then supposedly it's supposed to work. And there is a very high failure rate on 200-page PowerPoint decks. And here's what you need to go implement. And then the software company, the executive team just can't quite get over the hurdle of the late nights and the worry about doing damage and the downside risk. And so it just becomes shelfware. But it is an emerging science that's still relatively new. And if you ask me the most inefficient structure of deploying software, it's the software sales transaction, what happens to actually deploy software where pricing kind of intersects with the sales dialogue is not a pretty picture.
Yeah.
For most.
And so thinking about this then, I mean, because as you mentioned, people see it as this black box, black magic, like kind of wing conversation at a bar, all of those kinds of things and the weight of these decisions. I mean, in your experience, how have people actually then made these decisions? Like what has the process looked like at a company level to go and decide what the pricing looks like?
Well, so that would vary by size. But let's say at the smallest level, it's typically a handful of the executives that are in a meeting debating. And I would say that the debate is not grounded necessarily always in the quantitative science part of it. It's more like, hey, should we move this minimum out? Hey, do you feel good about that, Vince? Yeah, I feel good about that. Let's do that. And then you don't really understand the ramifications. And then a couple of months later, you're like, hey, I know I said I wanted to do that, but can we go back to the other way? Because that's terrible. And then they kind of, thrash a bit. As you get into larger organizations, you'll start to see it begin to dissect between over on the CPO side. If you have profit and loss profitability, pricing will kind of segue or fall under that purview. You'll also see it under marketing, but it largely is delegated, which I think is a mistake. I mean, it is the revenue model. I think that connects directly to the CEO and sort of his charge for profitable growth, if you will, or her charge for profitable growth. And that delegation down into the organization as you then get bigger gets deeper. And so now all of a sudden you might have a miniature pricing team that's horribly understaffed, has no tools except Excel, and just doesn't have the equipment to do the job, and largely is doing the job of 100 people rather than one person. And in many cases, really just becomes a glorified deal desk rather than a pricing function, I think. But it's that delegation down, that sort of saying like, this is not an important function, so I'm going to push it down, I think is a huge problem of that effect that you're seeing, which is lack of ownership and no tools and no real cohesive team to pull it together.
Yeah. Is there also like a fear element to that, in the sense of, maybe I have no idea what I'm doing with this, so I'm going to delegate it because I'm just like scared to grapple with it?
Maybe. I think a lot of the executives are very sophisticated and obviously operating with the board are, know the metrics, know the business inside and out. The issue with pricing is the nuances matter. So, for example, you might be used to taking averages of things. And the problem in pricing, if you just cross the first bridge, is these are not normal distributions of deals. You typically have, let's say, if you were focused on SMB, you'll have a tranche of mid-market and enterprise deals that are just way off the mark. And they're like 10 standard deviations off the norm. And you'd be amazed how many times people just run an average inclusive of outliers, and they kind of use that to drive the business. And the challenge with that is it really does torque your understanding of what's happening under the hood. And it really does bring you down, I think, some dangerous paths. And so a lot of that is driven, though, because they don't really have a system by which to tease this out. They have a financial system that's after the fact, but they don't really have a system by which to understand or forecast what pricing decisions might yield and what they might make, and a marker in the sand that says, hey, am I really tracking on that trajectory or not? And so I think what happens is fear, maybe lack of confidence. Yes. You just feel like, I know I'm going to get hurt if I do this. I just don't know where I'm going to get hurt. And I think that lack of truth on the ground, transparency of seeing what's going on is really important and lacking. And then secondly, that ability to see the truth on the ground is often really obscured. Many software companies are kind of beholden to their systems, and the data is really rough. You'll have transaction data that's a bit kludgy. It's not complete. It's, maybe the net price is higher than the list price. Maybe there's some other weirdness going on. Maybe you have a bunch of credits in there. Like, there's all this stuff that takes a huge amount of time to get your arms around. And that's the part that, again, I'm not sure it's scary as much as it's just like you kind of roll your eyes like, how do I get there from here?
Future Fuzz is sponsored by SalesSource, B2B pipeline management and sales growth for your business.
Yeah, because for me, that feels like the process. Like, I'm about to go and sell my car and lease a new one, and just beginning to be like, oh my God, I've got to look
grown,
at
right?
What's that?
Yeah. You just grown.
Yeah, it's a nightmare, because you got to figure out all these different dealerships and the different kinds of models and what are the safety ratings. And now I got to worry about the different kinds of percentages that they're charging me for whatever kind of deal I'm going to make if I'm buying it versus leasing. And it's just like your head explodes. You don't want to deal with it. And I've ignored a lot of calls and emails from car dealerships lately. So,
that phenomenon is a real phenomenon. I mean, I've been in those meetings, and I can see the point at which the executive team is like, the headache factor gets so large, things become so incomprehensible to get your arms around, that ultimately you're like, I think we'll just do that next year. That'll be a learning objective or an objective for next year, but we're not really going to touch that right now. It reaches a point of too much to process.
Yeah. And so, like, if you're trying to then figure this out and come up with process, where do you even begin? And I know that's kind of a loaded and wide question, but just from this basic level of, we don't have pricing, or we need to wrangle our pricing and get it to a better place, how do you get started?
Well, I think the place that you would, so rather than describing what you think the problem is, I think the place to start is like, if you are lucky enough to have transactions to look at, it's amazing the wealth of information that's inside of there. There's a talk track out in the market that says, oh, you're doing pricing, you should greenfield this. I mean, why anchor yourself to yesterday? And the problem with that approach is that if you don't anchor yourself to yesterday, you might come out with pricing that's very different than what you have today. And you might actually not just spook tomorrow's prospects. You might spook yesterday's customers when they see the new pricing and go, holy crap, I'm not going through that with renewal. I'm out and I'm going to go to a competitor. And there's real costs associated with overshooting, I guess. And so if you just were to take the first step that says, well, I'm going to just get clean deal data. Like, I just want to understand, what have we sold at the line item level, the quantities, the list price, the net price, the discounts. Like, many of our companies have hundreds of SKUs, unique product codes that they sell. Some just have a dozen, others have 60,000 plus, and that's an ocean to boil. But if you can get that clean and ingest it in some sort of tool that you can visualize and start to see what's happening, it will shake out a lot of really low hanging, juicy fruit that you can go after. Like, so for example, in COVID, many of our clients, we have a level setter platform. When you pull up the data, you could immediately see 100% discounts on a whole tranche of deals. You're like, oh, what's going on with that? You go look and you're like, well, we're selling in year terms. These are 2, 3, and 4 month terms. What's happening? Well, you could immediately tell salespeople were having trouble moving product. So they would say, hey, Vince, listen, land and expand, right? Why don't we just try this? We'll just kind of go ahead and get it started. You'll fall in love with it. A couple months later, you can go ahead and sign up. And of course, those signups weren't occurring. You would never see that. It's not really necessarily going to be in the talk track. You might hear it from a salesperson saying, oh, we're trying land and expand, but you wouldn't associate that with the mechanic of a shorter term, which isn't really in the playbook, and sort of the salesperson going off script because they're just trying to make their numbers, rightfully so. And that's one of hundreds of examples of little leaks in the game that you want to pay attention to. If you don't ground yourself in the reality of what you've been able to extract in the form of net prices yesterday and that action, if you will, then I think you're beholden to that which is most recent. You go into an executive team, the CMO is like, well, let me tell you what happened yesterday. It happens to be a one-off, but that like dominates the discussion. So now you're going to react or want to change something based on that story. And that takes you away from, I think, that science. That puts you more into sort of gut check and feel and that thrashing that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. And when you think about it, I mean, a lot of times there's this truism, I guess, or I'll say a Hermosiism, if you will, of like this idea of you solve some of the biggest problems. Those are the things that also give you the most success. Like those things you're most afraid of or have the most anxiety about, like you get those things done, you've made major headway. And I feel like pricing is one of those. And so like for all these people that are having all these different decisions with not analyzing the data, burying their head in the sand, punting on it, whatever it is, when they finally get this together and have a process, have the right data, start being more scientific about it. I mean, you mentioned casually earlier, for example, how a certain decision offhandedly was going to change $8.5 million. So, I mean, what are some of the
some decisions are more?
Yeah, and that's what I'm curious about is like some of the weight of the results or really the quality of the results when people get their pricing right.
Well, there's no doubt about it. There's an enormous upside with getting pricing right. I mean, you can imagine a world where everything was manual, paper, pen, and you and I were bringing automation to the scene. And this was the story of my previous software company. We would take purchasing departments down from 40 people to like one in a backup. Your ROI is exquisite. In fact, one would argue your ROI is so large, people won't believe you. So if you come across a market like the B2B software space, where historically pricing was never treated as a discipline, you just can accidentally make money. I mean, it is very, very easy coming off of a total lack of discipline and installing just some basic discipline to move the needle significantly. So it really is a large moneymaker. It's just hard to take the recommendations as they flow out to the sales dialogue with the sales team, as they flow out to your sales operational systems and supporting backbone, as they flow out to how you're going to market, as they flow out to the code base and how you're going to control and license entitlement and management and billing. And like that stuff is the stuff that makes people's head hurt. But in reality, there are very nuanced things that you can do that move the nozzle in a really large way, or move the needle in a really large way. And when you, for example, let's take an example, like we have a business model that historically has never done any sort of volume pricing. Like they've started in B2B, the price is the price, it's X dollars per user, X dollars per token, I don't care, it's just the price is the price. And then they start to attract very, very large customers. Those very large customers will expect some sort of volume treatment. They're like, hey, I'm showing up, I'm 100 customers in one, so what are you going to do for me? Just instituting some structure for that really greases the skids for those kinds of companies or those kinds of customers that are coming on board. And we have a client who historically sold to a university over in London. It's a development license for $1,250 every 3 years. They just finished their project and closed a deal, 10-year term, $300,000 a year. that gives you kind of just a little bit of a meter as to how much money can be left on the table. And now the founder's like, hey, I really feel like I have a business. Like, because that really is no longer a hobby. That really is a business. And that's what I mean by most software companies do not get paid anywhere close to their value. And in fact, if pressured as to why they created the price they did, there's no reasonable, rational answer to that because the software company hasn't even produced that yet. So a salesperson can't even talk about that. And that just means if I'm asking you for $1 million, you're probably going to close me at $10,000 because I just have nothing to lean on. And I think that putting that back into the software company ecosystem by saying, hey, pricing is a discipline. It needs to have some people assigned to it, or at least a person, or at least a dedicated fractional time from somebody in your organization. And we're going to need some supporting tools, not just Excel, but other supporting tools. And we need a good process to do this, puts it on par with product management and other disciplines. And you're probably a little bit younger than I am, but I still remember when product management came online. You know, I'm of the era where you built it and they just would come, and thankfully they came. But like many people built it and nobody came. But now we would laugh at that in product management as a discipline. If you fast forward 10 years and rewind to this particular podcast, you'll see pricing on par with product management as a discipline.
Yeah, so
it's just very new.
So, Chris, for all the people then that are hearing you explain all of this, I mean, and are desperately looking for that science and structure when it comes to pricing in their business, what is the best way to get in touch with you and Software Pricing Partners?
Softwarepricing.com.
All right. Well,
easy to remember.
There you go. So go check it out. And Chris, thank you so much for being a part of the show. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in and making the choice to listen to this podcast. If you liked what you've heard today, please don't forget to subscribe.